We have here a 2007 Chevy Suburban, four-wheel drive, and we've got some kind of a noise coming from the front tire area. So we jacked up the car, we looked at all of the connecting joints, and they're all solid, but the tire wiggles as you put pressure on the tire on either side. The other tire over on the driver's side does not do that. So we're guessing that our best solution is to replace the bearing assembly. So today we're going to take a look at how to replace the bearing assembly on the passenger side of a 2007 Chevy Suburban. So we just loosen the nut just a little bit, and then we put a little bit of torque back onto it so as it would be snug. But that'll make it a lot easier later when we need to pull that nut off. So now we're going to remove the tire. We've taken the wheel off, and now we're ready to start taking the rest of the assembly apart that needs to come apart. It's always a good idea up front to get everything sprayed down with a good penetrating oil to let things soak while you're working on different areas of the assembly here. We sprayed the center nut that eventually we're going to get to that holds the hub together before we took the wheel off, and then we loosened it a little bit as you saw earlier. So that's already been sprayed. Now we're going to spray down the rest of them. We'll then take the brake assembly apart, and then we'll be able to get to the 3 bolts in the back that hold the hub assembly together. This one up here, and we have this one over here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take apart the brake assembly. So we're going to take the sliders off first on the top and bottom. There's 2 of them. They're a 19mm socket that's going to loosen those, and we'll remove them. After we remove this, remember you've got a hydraulic hose sitting back here that you don't want to stress. So you need some way of hanging this shoe assembly to keep it from damaging the hose. Personally, I like to use brake hooks. You can use wire, clips, whatever works well for you. Some people will set it on a jack. I'm not real fond of that because it could fall off and damage the hose from there. Something that will secure it. Now that it's loose, we're going to hang it. I'm going to put the hanger back here off of the wishbone, and then this will just slide off, and we can hang it right back here off of this lower assembly, and you can see that it's taken all the tension off of the hydraulic hose. Next, you want to take the brake pads out. They'll just slide right out. You can take them off. While they're out, it's a really good time to check the surface of the brake pad. Try not to actually touch it. You don't want to get any grease or oil on the pad surface itself. Of course, we'll clean those before we put it back together again. And that'll take the front and back pads off. Keep them together so as that you make sure you have a mated pair. So sometimes these nuts and bolts on these automobiles that's been on for a while can be very, very difficult to get off. I would have used breaker bars earlier in the video. This time I'm going to use a small impact wrench, half-inch small format impact wrench from DEWALT to get this lower one off because I can't get it easily with a breaker bar. And so that brings that one out. Now for the top one, we were able to get it loose with the breaker bar. So I'm just going to take that out with a ratchet and loosen that up. Now these, by the way, are 18mm sockets that we're using for these bolts. I like to be using the impact wrench because it's faster, but the wishbone won't let me get in there with the impact wrench. But it doesn't take long. So there's a small little bolt here at the that holds the brake assembly together, or the rotor assembly together for the brakes and everything. And it's just a convenience bolt to hold everything in place while you mount tires and things of that nature. So it's just a small little Torx. It's a T30. You notice I'm using only a 1/4 inch drive, so it shouldn't be very tight in there. You just need to loosen it up and just take it out. Now, normally your rotor assembly for the brakes should come off fairly easily. And notice how loose this one is, because the brake job has been done fairly recently. However, if you find that they're rusted together and that this plate is not coming loose very easily, you can tap it on the back side with a mallet. I'd recommend a dead blow mallet, or you can also have pop loose nuts or bolts that you put in. There's two threaded holes here and here that you put in a bolt in those, and then as you tighten that bolt up, you want to tighten it symmetrically between the two, and maybe go, once you get it snug, maybe go a half turn on each, and then that'll pop this plate loose. And that's probably better than hammering on it. You're less likely to damage anything if it's really tight. Now that we have the brake rotor off, we can now get to the hub assembly. And we sprayed the bolts earlier, and you saw that earlier in the video where we were spraying all the bolts. We're going to respray them on the back side again that hold the hub assembly together. But you also want to spray along the plate line here to help separate the hub from the support bracket, to make things come apart a lot easier. And you also want to get it on the threads on the back side as well, so you get a little extra penetration. Okay, the next step is to take the nut off of the center drive shaft here. Now, if you remember earlier, while the wheel was still on it, it was on the ground, so we had a lot of ability to put a lot of torque on this. We loosened it, but we loosened it just a little bit, so I don't need to use the impact wrench this time to finish taking it off. So now we can just spin that off of there. And remember that we did tighten it just a little bit, just so that everything held together while we were taking all the other parts off. Now, after you get the nut off, you'll find that there is a tension washer, very thick. It's not obvious it's there, and you don't want to drop it and have it roll away, so be sure you grab that as well. Now, it's very important at this point to make sure that you have play on your drive shaft going through the splines. And hopefully, like this one, you can be able to just push it in and out. And you want to push it in quite a ways, as that'll make it easier for taking the bolts off of the back of your hub assembly. So you want to just push that in. If it's frozen, you're going to need to be sure you get some penetrating oil on it. Please don't use a hammer to try and knock it loose. If you're going to need to use something like a hammer to knock it loose, be sure you get a piece of wood or something of that nature that's made for being beat on. Because if you hit it hammer metal hammer to metal end and you miss just a little bit, you're going to mush your threads, and then you've got a real problem. Now you've got an axle to replace. So be sure when you make that, get that shaft loose, that you don't do anything to damage those threads. I'm not a fan of putting a nut on there and hammering on the nut. That's another way of getting things messed up as well. So use a block of wood or a piece of hard plastic that, you know, is made to be hammered on if you have to beat on this thing to loosen it up. But it does need to be loose. It does need to be shoved back as far as you can get it to go. All right, so now we're going to take those 3 bolts off of the back of the hub assembly. Personally, because it's kind of awkward getting in on some of the angles, I like these impact wrench swivels, where it swivels on there. You need a 15 millimeter socket. So I'm going to use that on a ratchet, and then we'll go back here and we'll take each one of those off. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to take each one out. At this stage, it really doesn't matter if you take them all the way out or whether you just work on each one a little bit at a time. My personal favorite is to work on them a little bit at a time so that they don't all come out, and then that'll allow you to have the ability of breaking this assembly loose if it needs to come loose. Now, before you take them all off, once you have them loose, then you want to take and be sure you remove your ABS sensor wire after you get the hub loose here. And the reason you want to wait until after you have the hub loose is because if you have this wire flopping around and you accidentally pinch it with one of your wrenches, say your breaker bar, then you have a problem in terms of the replacement part. So be sure and loosen everything up. You can see how it's very loose at this point now that we've got all the bolts loose. So before we take the assembly off or we finish taking the bolts off, we're going to now remove the harness. First off, go for the upper one. A tool like this can be very handy at popping these out without breaking the harness so that you can reuse them. Just kind of wiggle it back and forth and just pry as gently as you can. So in order to get the harness apart, you can slide a screwdriver, and just inside here is a little harness clip. So if you just pop that underneath that harness clip just a little bit so as it comes up, then you can separate these 2 pieces. It looks like we went ahead and did break the bottom stem here that holds it into the frame. It happens sometimes with the older parts, but guess what? We're putting a whole new harness assembly on there, so we'll be good to go. So you'll notice this one has a little different assembly. You might have to go back and forth on it. It's got 2 hooks that latch into one another. So you take a little screwdriver so you can push in and kind of wiggle it back and forth, and then that just comes up. Again, old plastic, try not to bend it too much so that you do not break it. There it comes. All right, so again, you can see how that one, I needed to work on it just a little bit, taking a little bit at a time to where you could get it to come out of the slot there. Then again, it just opens up so that you can take it off of the harness and put it back in. Again, be gentle again when you're taking that apart, because again, it's old plastic and it's likely to crack. Again, you can see the little hooks that I was working around trying to get it out of the slot. And that's what's going to go back in and hold them in place. Okay, so now that we've got the harness loose, and now we can take the rest of the hub apart. So you can see again that we have our hub is very loose on there. Our plate is nice and loose. And so now I'm going to take the rest of the bolts off that we haven't taken off. so we can actually remove the hub itself. So now we've got the last bolt off, and you'll notice that your plate is going to tend to move. So you want to be sure you watch how your plate is oriented, because you need to be sure that this cutout is available at the spot where the sensor goes into the hub. So just make sure that you realign it, or you can realign it by paying attention to how that plate comes off. So now that I've got the last bolt out, then we can go ahead and remove the hub assembly along with the wire, and then remove the backing plate. So once you have your hub out, you want to be sure and take a look at your splines, your threads, and the interior holding surface on the frame to make sure that all parts are clean or relatively clean. And if they're not, then you want to be sure and clean them up. Make sure that everything's going to slide back together again nicely. Ours is not very bad, so we don't really need to do much cleanup work. About the only thing we really need to do is kind of make sure we get the dust and debris off of the bottom here that just fell as we were pulling things apart. You'll notice that your axle is also freely sitting at this point. Again, this is a good time to go ahead and pick up your axle and to make sure you examine it, make sure that all of the splines are clean, you've got good threads, and your threads are all clean. Your inner race of where your hub's going to go back in is all clean. Ours is all pretty clean, so we don't have to do much. Just kind of brushed out some of the debris that fell in there. But you also can wiggle it and make sure that your CV joint is in good condition. And see if you feel any play or any areas in there that may indicate you might need to do some additional work. And now's the time to do it, rather than put it all back together again and then have to do it again. Take it all apart later for that joint. Okay, now for the next part where we're putting on the new hub, one thing that's very, very important is you want to clean your hands. You notice how dirty my hands were before. I mean, this is a brand new part. You don't want this part getting infections or diseases because of your grubby hands. So clean your hands. Get yourself nice and clean. Scrub them well. All right, now we're ready to start putting our assembly back together again, starting, of course, with putting the hub back on the axle. We hadn't taken the hub out of the box yet, but now that we have, we noticed that we got a good quality hub that has all of the parts and all the clips on there that we were being so gentle about using and taking apart in order to salvage those before. So if you might want to take a look in your box and see if you've got all your clips, and that'll give you a pretty good idea of how gentle you need to be with taking your clips out of your frame assembly when you're taking your old hub off. So we've got this clip. This is the one that we broke off. We managed to salvage this one, but this one was, of course, we have a new one. And of course, this one here, we also have a new one for it as well. Before we start assembling everything, it's really a good idea to put a little anti-seize on various surfaces. Now, it's not something that is critical, but it just makes your life easier if you have to do this job again, and it does help prevent things from rusting. We're going to use a copper-based anti-seize. The most important surface for the anti-seize would be the threads for the nut that holds the hub on. But we're going to go ahead and put a little bit on the splines, and again, we just need just a little tiny bit. You don't want to use too much because we're not trying to paint the surface, we're just trying to get a little bit on there. Put a little bit onto the threads for the nut, and again, the nut will drive that little bit we put on the front on down as it tightens up. I also like to put a little bit on the inside of the race where the hub goes. Again, this isn't so much to keep anything from seizing as it is. It makes it just go together a little bit easier, and it keeps the parts from rusting. So I like to put just a little bit on there. And again, you notice we're very gentle and very thin with the amount of anti-seize we put on there. So now it's time to start putting our assembly back together again. So of course, the first thing we need to do is we cannot forget to put our plate on. Again, make sure you know how it lines up. So there's the 3 holes lining up, and this is where the sensor cable goes through here. Now, I like to put a bolt through the top one just to hold it in place while we position everything else. So it kind of gives it a little bit of ability to kind of move things around while we put the hub on there. So with that in place, I can now take and pick up the hub, position it carefully so that you know where the cable goes. So you want to go ahead and get the cable through the slots. And we lost it off of the bolt. Not a big deal. Okay, so at this point now we pick up the axle. So remember, this axle is floating, and we want the axle to be sure and be even with going into the hub. So again, making sure that all the pieces are lined up carefully. Now it's time to start gently working the hub onto the spline. And it may take a little bit of wiggling to get it to line up just exactly right on that spline. So we've put the 3 bolts on the back side of the hub assembly to hold it in place. We haven't tightened them or torqued them down yet. They're still a little just kind of finger tight to make sure everything lines up. You might have a little bit of an issue getting the splines to go together. So you may need to juggle your axle assembly with one hand while trying to put this on with another. It's very difficult with one person to hold the axle assembly together, the hub, and try and align the splines. So if you can get a second person to help you out, so you have 3 or 4 hands kind of holding things in place, you'll find it'll slide together a lot easier. But if you just by yourself, you can still do it. It just may take a little time and a little patience while you move things around to try and get them to line up. Once you do have them aligned, though, you'll find that it slides on the spline, or should slide on the spline very easily. Again, should slide it right up to that bolt that we loosely put in on the top to hold the plate assembly on. And you can then get a few threads on that to take the weight off of the rest of the flange assembly while you put the rest of the bolts in and get things aligned and make sure everything is right. Now notice we haven't put together our sensor assembly yet, but that's the next thing we're going to do, is go ahead and put the sensor assembly together, and that'll keep the cable out of the way so that when we torque the bolts on the back side, we don't accidentally clip that cable. Come on. There it goes. Now this last clip, after you put the clip together, you'll notice that there's an alignment pin and a pin with the serrations on it in order to hold it in the frame. You need to make sure that both holes are aligned properly to hold this in place before you press it in. So remember to put in your thrust washer. It's very important that that is in there. Then you want to put on your nut. At this point, you don't need to have the nut really firmly in place. We're going to go ahead and torque that up after we get the wheel on, as it just makes it a lot easier to hit the torque marks that you need to make. But you do want to go ahead and make sure everything is going to seat up nicely before you finish torquing down the 3 flange bolts in the back. And so that's why it's a good idea to go ahead and put the nut on here to make sure that everything is lined up well before you torque those out. Now we're going to torque the 3 flange bolts. We've already snugged them down evenly. So you want to be sure that you're not just tightening one at a time. Go ahead and get them all good and snug. Now you want to go ahead and torque it. We're going to torque it to 130 foot-pounds. Okay, so now it's time to put the brake rotor back on. We noticed that it is kind of grimy from where we've been holding it. We'll clean it just before we put the pads on. That's the best time to clean it because it's easy to get your fingers all over it trying to put it on. Again, the only thing that really holds the disc on is the little 12-point bolt that is a Torx 30. And so you want to be sure that you line up one of your whole slots that's available for you for that. You'll notice that you've got 3 of them here that you can use, but you want to make sure that when you put this on that one of those 3 is lined up with the threaded hole here. Now earlier we discussed that there was these threaded holes for helping to pop this off if it needed the help to get it off. That's different than this threaded hole, which is used to just hold this disc, the brake disc assembly together on the hub while you're mounting tires and everything else. So I've got a nice clean spot right there. I'm going to line that up with that one down there, and then we'll just slide the rotor assembly back on. You'll notice that you can still see the threads through there. Now we're just going to align this. Notice it will go in very, very easily. Again, that's a T30 on the Torx. And it doesn't take very much. So just a quarter socket will work just fine to tighten that up. And all you just need to do is just kind of give it just a little snug fit there, and that'll keep your assembly together while you put your brakes on. This is a good point to go ahead and clean the rotor and get the grease off. Some people will wait until after they have the pads on. I get concerned about having a little grease on the pads. The grease comes off the pads a lot more difficult than they do when you have the rotor free. So this is a good time to go ahead and clean the rotor front and back. Make sure that you've got all the grease off of the braking surface on both sides. So the next thing we did is we went ahead and put on the bracket for the brake pads, and we're going to torque the bolts using a 18 millimeter socket, and we're going to torque it to 100 foot-pounds. All right, so we've reassembled the brake assembly. We put the pads on. We've gone ahead and torqued down all of the bolts that need to be torqued down. Made sure everything stayed clean, and that's important with the brakes. You want to make sure you don't get any grease on any of the surfaces that are mating between the rotor and the front of the brake pads. Hopefully you've already got a pretty good handle on doing brakes, so from there we're now going to put the wheel on. We're going to lower it down, then we'll torque this center nut to spec, and then we'll go ahead and torque the wheel nuts, the lug nuts, and we'll be done. So we've got everything assembled now. We've got all the brakes on, we've checked the brakes, They feel solid. We don't see any leaks. We've got the wheel on. We've torqued the lug nuts down to 110 pounds per square inch, PSI, or foot-pounds, I should say. And now we're going to finish up our job of tightening up the center nut on the axle. So now we're going to torque it down to our spec, which is 156. Check the specs for your particular vehicle to make sure that it matches, and be sure and torque it to the proper spec. So, and that'll wrap up our activity here. So we're now gonna torque this down, and there you just heard it pop. Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful.